And we are live. Hi, everybody. My name is Marianne Morea, and I am an urban fantasy, paranormal romance, or paranormal romantic suspense author. And I'm going to be moderating today. It's a writing locally is basically what this panel is about, and how we write what we know from where we are, what we know from where we live. So I'm going to start by just everybody introducing themselves and where they're from. I'll start. I am in New York, about 30 miles outside of New York City. And it's actually a sunny day. It's been raining for the last 5 days. And, I'm going to send it over to Jenn.
Sure. I'm Jenn Burke. I am here from just outside of Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. I write paranormal and science fiction romance, and my latest series is the Not Dead Yet series, which is set in Toronto, but I also have set books in Ottawa, Montreal, Prince Edward Island. Basically, anywhere I can think of to set them in Canada, I set them.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. Ellis?
Hi, yeah, I'm Ellis Leigh. I am currently just outside of Chicago in the northwest burbs of Chicagoland. I am Midwestern girl through and through. Originally from Detroit, I set my books in the Midwest. Luckily, we have everything from big cities to cornfields, so that leaves me a lot of room to play. And I write paranormal romance. I write contemporary as Kristen Hart, and I co-write erotic romance as London Hale.
Wonderful, thank you. Melissa?
Hi, I'm Melissa Keir. And while I currently live in South Carolina, I've spent all the rest of my years in the Midwest. I was born and raised in a small town outside of Cleveland called Amherst, Ohio, and spent most of my years after getting married in Michigan outside of Ann Arbor. So I set a lot of my stories in the Midwest, except for my series, which I set in a small town in Colorado.
Okay, so my first question to you guys is, what is unique about where you live that led you to your story?
So I live in the Ottawa area, and for those of you who don't know, Ottawa is the capital of Canada. So we have Parliament Hill downtown. That's where all of the politicians do their business. So we're like the equivalent of Washington, D.C. So my first book, I set in Ottawa, and one of the unique things about it is that Parliament Hill is actually a hill, a cliff that overlooks the Ottawa. Base of that hill. So that was a lot of fun to write, because it was like this inside joke that Parliament Hill was built on top of a portal to hell. So that was one of the unique things about it. Now, for my other books, for The Dragon CEO's Assistant, that's also set in Ottawa. And Ottawa didn't play a huge role in that particular book, not like it did with my first book with the unfortunate name of Her Sexy Sentinel. Not my name. I wish I could change it. But The Dragon CEO's Assistant, one of the things that comes in is that Ottawa is also a kind of a Silicon Valley North, or it had a heyday of that back in the early 2000s. So that was something that I pulled on for The Dragon CEO's Assistant, where the CEO is actually the CEO of a tech company. So this is the kind of thing that, Ottawa's got this really interesting kind of mix of, we've got the tech, we've got the staid politicians and bureaucrats and bureaucracy, and the town itself, or the city, is 1 million people, but it's spread out over such an enormous amount of land that it doesn't really feel like that. If you go to our downtown, It might be 10 blocks in total. We don't have skyscrapers. In Ottawa, there's actually a bylaw that says that no building can be taller than the Peace Tower, which is part of Parliament Hill. So that's something that I try to keep in mind, because that is kind of a unique thing about Ottawa, the fact that you can go to our downtown and all of our office buildings are 30 stories or less. We don't have anything that's higher than that. So that's kind of an interesting aspect of Ottawa.
Terrific, thanks. Ellis?
Yeah, so I am, as I said, I'm from the Midwest of the United States. And there's a lot of variance here from, like I said, cornfields to big cities, smaller towns. I lived in the suburbs of Detroit. And I actually got really, I had a bit of a fascination in college with linguistics and dialect and where words come from and why we say certain things that we do. Like in the Midwest, we call carbonated beverages pop. Other places call them soda. You go down south, it's all a Coke. I don't care what flavor it is, it's a Coke. And so I became really obsessed with that kind of thing. So setting everything in the Midwest, I had a really big canvas to play with. I have a series set here just outside of Chicago, where I get to play with the fact that there's a big city here, the fact that we have forest preserves all over the place right outside the city. So you have this kind of wildlife happening as you're looking at skyscrapers. I also placed a contemporary series in Downriver, Michigan, which is just south of Detroit. It's like 13 small communities, very blue collar, very steel worker, very auto industry. In my hometown, there are still signs up to this day where they have signs up in parking lots that say that if you park a foreign car there, you will be towed. So, those are the kinds of little tiny quirks that come up. The weird little driving around in the Midwest, and there's all of a sudden there's a trailer park. Like you're in a suburb and it's a nice suburb and there's a trailer park and it's a nice trailer park, and it's so unique here. And then I also spent a lot of time traveling the country and realizing how different some of these places are from other places. So yeah, that's why I do what I do. I like Melissa. I have a series based in a town in Colorado because I went out to Colorado and loved it. It had a totally different vibe than anywhere I'd ever been. But mostly I stay Midwest because there's plenty of options right here that I can play with all day long.
Terrific, thank you. Melissa?
Well, I like to I have a whole series. There's 5 books set in Amherst, Ohio, which is a small town right on the coast of Lake Erie. You could go half hour and you would be in Cleveland, but growing up, that's not what we did. We stayed in this small town. That's where we went to school. It's where we, hung out at the McDonald's. And so that small town feel became very vital to my story about the Wilder sisters, because there was a certain demographics in the town. There was a certain feel to the town as far as religion. And so I wanted to include that in that series, both as a setting, but also as one of the antagonists in the story, where the kids are trying to fight against that, because that feeling of I want to escape this small town life, and then you come back to it as an adult finding that, wow, it's really not as bad as I thought it was going to be, and maybe there's some wonderful redeeming features in it. Amherst, Ohio also has a history, being that they are the sandstone capital of the world. The Lansing State Capitol in Michigan actually is built from sandstone in Amherst, Ohio, that came from there. And so many of the buildings across the United States got their sandstone from that area. And so I have a science fiction paranormal romance where he's a shifter, and it takes place in these quarries where I, would play as a kid, where you could run and all of a sudden see somebody's tombstone because they were trying to cut it out of the sandstone in the big giant wall, and there was a mistake, and so they left it there rather than cut it out. And so there's a whole interesting nuance to that. And then as you move further south in Ohio, you start moving down towards Columbus, which is a big town, and then you move back to small towns like in Athens. And I even took those small towns and tied them into my Colorado series. Athens, Ohio is where the Ohio University is, which is a big, not Big Ten school, but a big Ohio school. And there is a last chance rescue where they rescue animals, particularly foals that have been given away because their parents got pregnant, as most racehorses do, but then they don't want them to keep the babies, so they give the babies away. So I bring those hometown pieces into my other stories because I think they're just so important, and they're quirky and they're fun. And I mean, who wouldn't love the French fry capital of the world, or who wouldn't love wanting to be somewhere like that? So that's what I do with my stories.
Thanks. That's interesting. That just gave me a little bit of the creeps. The tombstone still stuck in the on the side of the quarry. That's cool. But I mean, being from New York, being 30 miles outside of the city, it's very suburban in Westchester County, because I'm 30 miles north as opposed to Long Island, which is to the south and east. For me, I grew up in the Hudson Valley. I grew up in a city called Yonkers, which, if you guys ever watched not My Fair Lady, Hello Dolly, it's Yonkers it was a big part of that. But I spent an awful lot of time along the corridor of the Hudson River. All of those towns include, well, Yonkers is considered the bastard stepchild of that, but all of the river towns, that's exactly what they are. And it's all of them, Dobbs Ferry and Tarrytown and so forth. And Tarrytown is where Sleepy Hollow is. It was originally Sleepy Hollow. And then it was renamed North Tarrytown. And then I guess maybe about 30 years ago or so, they decided to go back to their roots and call it Sleepy Hollow again. But Sleepy Hollow has always been part of my life because I spent an awful lot of time there growing up. But it's where my husband's from. And it's where our children were born. So, it's where our pediatricians were, and, where my mother-in-law went to high school and got married, and where my husband grew up and so forth. And so Sleepy Hollow and the legend of there has always been a part of my life. But where I am in the Northeast, there's tons and tons of old cemeteries that go back, to when New York was New Amsterdam, and it was owned by the Dutch as opposed to the British, which got everything started on our way to being America. And so I used to walk around the cemeteries and look at all of the headstones and look at all of the different monuments and the mausoleums and so forth. And I know that sounds creepy, but the architecture sometimes is just so beautiful. And if you go there in the spring, or really in all the different seasons. And I used to find myself wondering about the people that were buried there, their lives, and what happened to them, and what, and that was a lot of the impetus behind my stories, is just that kind of was my jumping off point. So all the history that's involved in the Hudson Valley, where I'm from, especially American, the American history back to the Revolution, is something that kind of speaks to me. So that's where I'm from. And that's what makes where I'm from unique to me. So, okay, so our next question is urban legends. Have any of the areas where you're from have any urban legends that may have played into your writing, and how? We'll start with Jenn again.
Good question. So some of the history of Ottawa is that it was originally known as Bytown because of Colonel By, who was the fellow who was in charge of building the Rideau Canal from the St. Lawrence up to Ottawa. So the idea is that they wanted to get the lumber that was being all the trees that were being cut down around the Ottawa Valley, because that was one of the biggest industries at the time, and they wanted to get that lumber instead of going down the Ottawa River to go down to the St. Lawrence instead. So they built this the Rideau Canal, and that was in the early 1800s, and it was an undertaking that resulted in many deaths, and a lot of the deaths were Irishmen. or like people from Ireland who had come over to, find a new life because of what was going on in Ireland. And they ended up working on the Rideau Canal, and I believe they got malaria from mosquitoes at one point. There were, accidents in the canal and all of that stuff. So, so that's part of the history of the town. Now, it doesn't play hugely into what I write, but there are a lot of stories that I kind of, I have in the back of my head when I'm writing. We had in the mid 1800s, there was a fairly high profile murder right downtown on, I believe, what is now Spark Street. And this was one of I believe it was a prime minister candidate or a politician, and he was actually shot in the middle of the street. And the person who did it was caught and was hanged at the jail a little, not too far away. But this is something that's really kind of colored the I guess the environment of Ottawa. It was Darcy McGee who was killed, and there's Darcy McGee everywhere. There's Darcy Streets, there's Darcy McGee Pub, there's all of these different things that harken back to this fellow who was killed on the street. And there's also stories of, the Bytown Museum, which is right downtown, right on the Rideau Canal. And there's stories in there that's one of the most haunted buildings in Ottawa. I have never seen anything there myself. I haven't. Apparently, you can, in better days than it is right now, you can go on tours there and possibly, have an experience. And there are ghost tours that talk about the history and the various ghosts and whatnot in Ottawa, as I'm sure most towns have. So there's all this kind of history in Ottawa, but Ottawa is generally this fairly new town in comparison to a lot of the cities in the United States. A few years ago, we went down to visit Salem in Massachusetts, just outside of Boston. And I'd always wanted to go there because of the history and, the occult aspect of it. And we had a great time, but the history in that place is just so incredible. And it's one of those things that Ottawa has pieces of that, but not quite back to the 1700s. We have, some buildings that are early 1900s, mid 1800s, but that's about as far back as stuff here goes. So it's interesting to kind of compare Ottawa to other locations, and what the history here is quite a bit different than what you would find elsewhere in other cities in the States. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. I actually found something similar, like when we had gone out to Arizona and up to the Grand Canyon and so forth. And we stayed at a hotel called El Tovar, and everybody was always, "Oh, it's so historic. Oh, it's so historic." And it was built in 1904. I was just like, that really? We've got 1610 where I come from. So anyway, but that's because New York was part of the original 13 colonies, and part of that whole, we're going to land on Plymouth Rock, or Plymouth Rock's going to land on you type of a thing. So anyway, Ellis?
I can't think of any urban legends like that would have been based around where I'm from, Midwest, especially a lot in Michigan. There was a large native population, which has influenced many things. You have mounds along rivers and things. You have one of the towns I grew up in, Wyandotte, Michigan, was named after the Wyandotte Indians who were there. There's still a totem pole in town. So you see that influence. The college I went to in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan had the Ojibwe language that you could take as a language credit. So you see that a lot. We do have famous riots. It's Detroit. I mean, you have lots of fun stuff. You have downriver Michigan. Probably our most famous murder was the Lawrence Delisle case, which has been done on the Confessions docuseries on Netflix, as well as the My Favorite Murder podcast. And it was a man who claimed his leg cramped, and he drove his station wagon into the Detroit River and killed his 4 kids. So, and his wife was in the car with him. And this was when I was a child. My grandpa, I remember the night that it happened, and my grandpa got called because my grandpa worked at the steel mill that was right there. And they were asking guys from the steel mill to come down to help because they were trying to get the car out. And because the Detroit River is not a river, it's actually a strait. And they've dug it down so far for industry that you don't go in the river, like, because the current and the undercurrent is too strong. You don't go in, nobody swims out there or anything. So it was a really bad situation. So that's a local incident that I remember. But our history is, it's the Detroit area. It's Henry Ford, Thomas Edison. It's all that kind of thing. You can still go. My sister, out of college, lived in the townhomes that Henry Ford had built for his factory workers because he wanted them to stay. A lot of people came up from the South up to the Midwest to get the jobs in the auto industry. So Henry Ford built these townhomes so that people could stay close. We have them in Chicago as well for other industries. People would build, if they had a plant, they built homes for people and lease them to people to keep everybody close together and basically keep everybody working. My Henry Ford, townhome. So it was really neat, that kind of stuff. But even that only goes back into the early 20th century. We don't go back as far as the colonies in the 1600s and things. We do have a few. There's a fort in Michigan, in the Detroit area, that goes back to before the Civil War. But that's pretty much all that I know of. Salt mines and agriculture, and we're home of the baseline system for calculating location. So instead of your property starts at that rock, runs along that river, we have baseline and vertices that come together, and that started in Michigan. That's our claim to fame. But that's about it.
No stories about Al Capone out in the Chicago area and the Valentine's murders and all of that. No hauntings.
That's a whole thing, and especially here, like I've been on a haunted Chicago tour, and so we went down the alley where Dillinger was shot. We went to where the St. Valentine's Day Massacre was. You do go to all the Capone stuff, but I'll tell you what, my now husband and I, my husband grew up in a town called Elmwood Park, which is Chicago's Little Italy that's not in Chicago. So it's where all the Italians moved when they moved out of the city limits. They had this little town called Elmwood Park, and to this day, there are soccer clubs. And every now and again, I'd go walking around the soccer clubs, walking around the neighborhood, past a soccer club, and it could be 100 degrees outside. And there's this big, burly guy in a suit with sunglasses on, sitting at the door to one of these soccer clubs that had all blacked out windows. And you just, you kept your head down and your mouth shut, and you did just fine. But there was a lot of, there's a lot of mob legends in that area. There was a shooting in the Circle in Elmwood Park where we lived, and it was a big deal because you don't attack the families. That was always a rule in Chicago, and especially the Italian mobs, was you don't go for the wives and kids, like you don't go for the families. And so that was a big deal when that happened. One of the last big mob guy that got busted was in our alley when we lived there on 73rd and Diversey. He was in our alley. I think it was Joey No Nos. But yeah, that's totally, mob legends out here are insane. Everybody knows somebody who's connected somehow. There's all kinds of stories about, my in-laws tell them all the time about, living in an Italian neighborhood. Somebody shows up at your house at 10 o'clock and they've got all these big roast beef that fell off a truck, and you bought a big roast beef for like $5. So that's a big thing here. But I didn't grow up with that. We didn't have that kind of influence. So it's fun to hear about and to go on these tours and things out here, but it's it's a little different.
Yeah, I know what that's like. I mean, my last name ends in a vowel. My maiden name is D'Ambrosio. So my great uncle Rocco was connected. And I remember when my dad was growing up, my dad's 80 now. I remember my grandfather, my grandmother's brother, who was Rocco, told my father point blank, "I'll break your legs if you go anywhere near that." So our soccer clubs too, Anyway, they're not quite soccer clubs because we have Mott Street and we have Little Italy, but there's also a lot of different. New York was very much ethnically segregated, especially in the city areas. Where my mom grew up and my dad grew up, it was the Italian section of Yonkers, and my mother grew up on Maple Street, and it was only half of the block was Italian, the other half was Ukraine, and you didn't cross the street. So anyway, it's amazing how things have changed, isn't it? And then for the better, for the better. Anyway, Melissa, urban legends.
The big urban legend that's around where we are is Gore Orphanage. So supposedly there is an orphanage back in the woods on Gore Orphanage Road, and it burned down, and children were unfortunately killed during this. And so kids would go out there at night and they would go to this cemetery that was on the road, and supposedly you could hear the kids screaming and you could hear crying, and it's one of those urban legends that turned out not to be real, but the story kept growing. And so they even made a movie out of it, and it's been on all these different TV shows and mentions. But everything that we've gone back and done research on the area has said that it's not true. So it's kind of misleading. But as we grew up, it was one of those, oh, I'm going to drive out there and stay out there at night and see what happens. Well, you let your own imagination get away with you, not anything else. Obviously during the quarries, there were times when people were killed and injured, rock slides, because they were not using a lot of mechanics to lift things like they would today. They were cutting the stone themselves and lifting it. And so there were a lot of deaths in the quarries themselves. And the area became very dangerous because you would be walking and you thought was on ground, and then suddenly it wasn't ground. Like what you've spoken about your towns, there were, different towns nearby. Lorraine was a little bit more seedy. People didn't go to Lorraine or didn't go to parts of Lorraine. Then, we had different parts. Amherst was basically a very, I guess you would say, white bread type of town. And supposedly there was some bell that would ring at like 4 o'clock, and everybody who was not white had to leave the town. All of these were all things that I heard, but I've not been able to prove, or not really, I guess, did a lot of research. When I lived in Michigan, I did find in one of the houses that I bought, though, and this is really kind of scary. I bought this house outside of Ann Arbor, and they do a title search, and they went back and they found on the title that said my domestics couldn't live there. Like, I would, first of all, from buying a house under 70,000, I don't have domestics. Let's not kid you. I don't have domestics. But yes, it was a very interesting piece how the racial segregation was going on in these small towns, even outside of the big cities like Detroit. So,
do any of you ever use any of these little tidbits in your stories? I'm not talking about the segregation bit, but the hauntings, or do they lend themselves to the creep factor in some of your books, or into the paranormal elements that are in your books? Do they lend it at all, or are they an impetus?
I would say yes. I know in my Feral Breed series of shifters, so right down the street from me is what was the Maryville orphanage as well. Big, huge building. And I based the home of the president of their shifter group of the NLB in there, as if it was not an orphanage, but just a giant home. And in the final book of the series, I actually have them come. The motorcycle club is coming to save the day, and coming literally down streets that are right by my house, because this is what I pass every day and this is what I think about. And I drive through these woods and I'm like, this is really creepy because it's a forest preserve. So you go from a busy street into these roads that take you through the woods, and there's nobody on them. There's nobody out there, but to me, they're just shortcuts, or they're an easier way to get across the river or whatever it is. And so I based it on all of that. Absolutely, I did. I can't think of anything else. I mean, my Pop the Clutch by Kristen Hart is based in Downriver. So everything, it's literally based in my hometown. I have them go down to Wyandotte to have dinner on Biddle Street, because that's what everybody does. You go down to Wyandotte, you go down to Biddle, and you park and you walk around and, hit up the shops and stuff. So yeah, I bring that kind of stuff in, but the creepiness, no, not really. I think if I was writing an urban fantasy in Chicago, that would be obviously easy. I shouldn't say easy, but that would be the easiest pick. If I was going to put an urban fantasy anywhere, I'd probably go Chicago, because there's so much creep factor here. There's so much history here that you can just kind of let that, all the ghost stories and all of that stuff come in and just weave their way through that fabric of the background. Absolutely.
Jenn, what about you? Does any of this influence your books?
Not directly, I don't think. I keep the history of Ottawa in my head, but I haven't written anything yet that kind of pulls on those strings. There are other authors out there that have done fantastic urban fantasies set in Ottawa. Charles DeLint is one that comes to mind. He's actually from Ottawa. And one of the first urban fantasies I read was his Moonheart book, which has a giant house set in a particular area of Ottawa, where all of the rooms go to different dimensions. And that was kind of my first sort of hint that, hey, I could write a story, a paranormal story, and set it in Ottawa, in a town that I know. So that was really interesting. Nathan Burgoyne also does urban fantasy set in Ottawa, and he does a really fantastic job of drawing in the French Canadian aspect of Ottawa. So for those of you who don't know, Ottawa is right on the Ottawa River, and the Ottawa River bisects Ontario, the province of Ontario, and the province of Quebec. And the province of Quebec is very French. Western Quebec has more English in it, but still there's a lot of history in Quebec that is very, very different from the rest of Canada, with it being the first place that was really settled in Canada. If you see Quebec City, it is incredibly old. I mean, that's where you're going to find the buildings that go back to the 1600s. I believe Quebec is one of the last walled cities in North America, or is the only, I'm not sure. But anyway, so there's all of that French Canadian history, and Nathan really pulls that in. One of his characters is a vampire who's French Canadian, and he's been around for something like 500 years. And you really see the history of the area kind of pulled in from that particular character. So I haven't written anything like that myself, but it is really interesting area. Not only Ottawa, but if you go a little bit about an hour south, right along the St. Lawrence, so that's the border between Canada and the United States, and there's a lot of history there with the War of 1812. If you go along that area, you can see the old stone houses that are pre-War of 1812. You can see the forts at Prescott. And various other little, places around there. So there's all of that history too that you can draw on. And it's just not really something I've done yet, but it is something that would be interesting.
Cool. Melissa, urban fantasies, fantasy, no, urban legends lending themselves to you, like the orphanage, maybe?
Well, I didn't write anything with the orphanage, but I did include the quarries as a perfect place for the dragon to be hiding out. He was the shifter, and so I certainly could see him living in the quarries there, and put the idea that he would be there as a safe place to hide his hoard and keep everything hidden from everybody else. But like everybody else, it's the small things. In one of my books, I've included the hot dog place that we always went to as kids and grew up at. The important piece was because it was somebody who was a teacher, and he established this, and it had become like a central location for everybody. And even when my kids were little in Michigan, we would drive the 2.5 hours down there just to get French fries, because that was the place to go. And so there's that nod to, when you're talking about that hometown, you've got to mention certain streets, you've got to mention certain buildings, you've got to mention certain building styles or architecture. And so, since our houses there are ones that were built in the 1800s and the 1700s, what kind of building materials? What are the things that you saw? So we wanted to be able to incorporate those kind of things.
Great. We actually have an audience question. It says, do you write what you know, or do you research into your town? If you research, do you have any tips? Okay, I guess I'll start, and then we'll go, back to Ellis after me. I do a lot of research, even though it's a place that I grew up and I knew, and I know so much about it. I don't know things that happened hundreds of years ago, like in my legend series, because I wanted to know if there were any urban legends that were particular to Sleepy Hollow that were outside of the legend of Sleepy Hollow that everybody and their brother knows. Everybody knows the Headless Horseman. And I did. I found a couple, and I incorporated the one of them has to the seniors at Sleepy Hollow High School for years and years and years always had this, they would have this party on Halloween, in the cemetery. So there's lots of criminal mischief. But so that the urban legend surrounds that. So I made friends with the Historical Society, and the gal who's the director, and she happens to be an archaeologist as well. And I made friends with a gal whose name is Tara Van Tassel, who is a direct descendant of Katrina Van Tassel, who's from the legend of Sleepy Hollow. And so the research that I do there is based on genealogies, and also whether or not it has to do with architecture and historic events that have happened in the town, to make sure that if I'm going to cite them, or if I'm going to fictionalize them at all, that they are as correct as possible. And that in the back of my books, I always make sure that if I have a fictionalized event that happens to be a historical event, that I make sure that the actual truth of that event is in an afterwards at the back, so that people will know exactly what happened. And especially also if I use an actual historic figure in my stories, like Andreas Emmerich was a Hessian soldier, Hessian commander, that I used in my book, in one of my books in Hollow's End. I had to make sure that he was real. I researched him. I researched everything that pertained to him and in reference to Sleepy Hollow, so that I could weave the truths into the story. So if it's based on a true story or inspired by a true story, that I've got it correct. So yes, the answer to your question is that I do my research, even though it's my hometown, even though it's like I've grown up here for the last 55 years. So yes. So Ellis, we'll go back to you for you to answer.
I do research, obviously. There's circling back to the whole linguistics thing that caught my attention in college. It's the tiny things that set regions apart. Like, if you're waiting, are you in line or are you online? If you're going to stop at a drinking fountain, is it a drinking fountain or is it a bubbler? When you go to the grocery store, do you grab a buggy, a cart, or a trolley? Like, there are tiny little language things that change in different regions. And so, working in the Midwest, writing my stories in the Midwest, that was easy enough because I'm from here and I've lived all over the Midwest. I have lived in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, all the way into the city of Detroit. I've lived in the city of Chicago. I've lived in Pennsylvania, Ohio. Like, I've traveled along. My family's from Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia. So I've kind of got little bits and pieces of all different places. When I decided to write a story based in a town on the Rocky Mountain front in Colorado, I did a ton of research. I spoke to friends who lived out there. I had already been out there. I actually was out there 3 times in a year and a half while working on this series. Fun note, if you're an author and you're setting a series someplace, travel to that place is a business expense because it's research. So that was fun. But I also, social media especially gives you so many insights into different places and different towns. Facebook groups help. I've joined Facebook groups for places in Colorado just to kind of get a feel for it. What are people talking about? What are they doing? What are their opinions on certain things? What's important to them, so that you can get that feel of it. And then also reaching out to friends. I've driven into the city of Chicago for people. Somebody wanted to set a story, and they had somebody trying to come around by the Lincoln Park Zoo. There's Couch's tomb, which is the only tomb on that side that's left over from like the World's Fair era. They've moved all the tombs out of that graveyard to make parks and stuff. And she wanted specifics, like, can you see it from here if I'm walking along this curve? So me and my cell phone, off we go. And I parked the car and started walking with my video and just recording so that she could get that view of exactly what she's looking for. But Google Street View works really great for that as well. So yeah, tons of research going into it to figure out what I'm doing, what I want to do, what's the feel of the place, what are the differences. My writing partner for London, Brighton Walsh, she writes a Reluctant Heart series, and based in a small town, Mississippi. And she went down to Mississippi to learn, and little things like, guys in that town that she's basing it on, they'll drop the F-bomb all day long. They won't say God. They won't say Jesus. They won't drop those types of language things. So little tiny things that you have to pick up and kind of make that mental note of and remember. So yeah, online research is excellent. In person's even better. Anything out there that you can find, any people you can find from there that you can reach out to and talk to, really, really help a lot.
Thanks, Ellis. And yes, you're right. Colloquialisms are important, and the actual physical places are important. And you got to be. I just want to. Google Maps is terrific. Google Satellite is terrific, but you also have to remember that if you're going to note real places in a real town, that there is going to be someone who is going to pick up your book and who's going to be from that place and who's going to call you on it if it's not right. So just make sure that you do your research thoroughly. And when in doubt, don't, because you don't want to get caught, you don't want to get caught saying that something's there and it's not, or that you can see something from someplace and you can't. So you can take creative license, but I would just be really careful. Jenn, you want to take a shot at this?
Sure. So I've written books set in Ottawa. I've written books set in Toronto. So for the Ottawa ones, for my first book, Her Sexy Sentinel, so I actually went down to Parliament Hill, and this was, probably 10 years ago-ish, and you could actually walk down behind Parliament Hill. There's a walking path that goes underneath along the river at the base of the cliff. So I went down there to find out, okay, where could I put this invisible door to the portal to hell under Parliament Hill? So I found a spot. So that was something that you wouldn't be able to do with Street View, even though Street View was available at the time. I actually had to go and look for that. So other things that I've used, that I've done research on, and how I generally set my locations for my stories, especially for the Not Dead Yet series, which was set in Toronto, is I'll go to Google Street View and I'll look around at various areas, and I'll see what type of businesses are there, what type of buildings are there. Is it university? Does it look like it's going to be a lot of rentals for university students? Is it more of an up class kind of neighborhood? Is it more of a working class neighborhood? So you get the sense of what could be in that area, and then I'll make stuff up. So I don't actually use actual buildings or other than like the ones that are for sure, University of Toronto, for example. In Give Up the Ghost, the second book in the Not Dead Yet series, there's some stuff that happens there, but it's, so I'm mentioning that it's University of Toronto, but I'm not really pointing out any super specifics about it. Although I did use Street View to go and have a look and see the types of buildings and see, the names of the streets, how they interconnect. So I can make reference to those things, and I can say, okay, there's a Tim Hortons on this street in this area, and there actually is a Tim Hortons in that area, so I could have people go in and have a meeting there. It's not a big deal. It doesn't play a huge role in the story, but it's that little bit of realism that kind of helps to draw the reader in. Now, the other thing that I've done for research is I'm lucky enough to have friends who are writers in Toronto, so I'm able to reach out to them and say, okay, so this area of town, what would they call it? So there's an area of Toronto that's called Cherry Beach. So what do they call it? Do they call it Cherry Beach, or do they call it the beaches, or do they call it whatever? That kind of information from my friends who live there. There was something else I was going to mention. Ellis, getting back to what you were talking about the language, that's something that I've really found when I'm writing, because I am writing stories set in Canada with an American editor, and very many that we use that just totally boggle my American editor. So that's really interesting, because unless it's in dialogue, I will switch it to the American structure instead, just to make everybody happy. But one of the things I try to do for my setting is I try to use the Canadianisms for the, have a character who's referring to distance. They will either refer to it how long it takes to drive there, because that's generally how we refer to it, or I'll have them really colloquially call kilometers clicks. So it's 100 clicks out of town. That's something that's said fairly frequently. So those little bits too, I think really help. And if you're setting a story in an area that you don't know or you don't live in, it's really important to find out about those little language quirks, because there's nothing that throws me out of a story more if it's set in the States or in Canada and they call a garbage can a rubbish bin. That really throws me out. So all of this kind of pulls together the location, the dialogue, the dialect, the diction, all of that pulls together to make the setting really strong.
Melissa?
I just have to reiterate what Ellis and Jenn and you are saying about this. There are times when I make comments in my story and my editor comes back and says, wait a minute, does that really happen? Yeah, that really happens that way. That's really how we talk, or that's really an action that we've done, because they haven't heard that or experienced that before. And I'm sure that readers do the same thing and are like, wow, that understanding of a location does take research. And the best ways to do it are to talk to real people, or whether you've met somebody, museums, newspapers, you've spoken to somebody, you do maps, you go and visit the area. For all of my stories, one of the things that I like to do is when I'm setting the story and I'm doing something where the character is outside doing the walk or taking a look, I'm actually there doing it too, so that I can see what it's like. If I so I'm actually there. I've got permission to be there, but I'm doing that. If I'm talking about a house in town, even if I'm not being very specific, because it's not a specific location like somebody's house, but I'm using descriptions, I want to have pictures of it. I want to see it so that I can refer back to it, because it's not something that I can always hold in my head, but I want to have that reference that I can go back to. And that's one of the great things, that when we're writing in a small town and we're writing a series or we're writing something locally, we have that ability to look again and again. So we can go there and take pictures, or we can go back and talk to somebody. So that's one of the best things.
I remember what I was going to say. So one of the other things, like where a young up and coming couple might live. So you search that on Google and you'll get blog posts about the up and coming neighborhoods in Toronto, or where things are getting, the old houses are being gentrified. You're getting new builds, or they're being, all these different transformations. So it's I can't imagine writing like this before the wonderful magic of the internet. That would have been so difficult. I would have been setting all of my stories in Ottawa so I could actually go there easily and walk through the various neighborhoods. So.
And one last thing I forgot about, and that is so huge, research is food. Cultures give up religion before they give up food. The only two large-scale changes in American food over the past 100 years have been bagels and salsa, that we as a culture have accepted, like, countrywide. So you have to think about the food as well. If you're doing a Thanksgiving dinner, if you're writing something in Chicago and you have a group of people meeting up after work for drinks and they order deep dish pizza, you are not from Chicago. Tourists eat that. That's a special occasion kind of food. When tourists come to town, we eat thin crust here. In Detroit, if you're basing something in Detroit, there better be Coney Islands all over the place, because Coney dogs, chili fries, gyros, that's our thing. And I mean, when I lived in outside of Detroit in the suburbs, I would pass 30 Coney Islands to get to the one that was mine. That was the one that I went to. So these sorts of things are really important. So that's another one to look at, is food. You may only mention it once or twice in a series. I tend to write a lot of food. My poor editor, I end up making her hungry a lot, because I bring food into like everything that I write. It's just part of me, I guess. But food is very important to different regions and different areas, and what is stereotypical may not be people actually eat there.
Italy in in New York City, and the only people who actually eat in Little Italy are tourists. Like the one of the most famous restaurants in Little Italy is Ferrara's, but it's okay, but it's not what my grandma cooked, and it's true. I just saw something on Facebook, and it was I guess it was a sausage gravy, or sausage, like they would do sausage and biscuits in the South. And it was almost like a chocolate fountain, but it had the sausage, the white sausage gravy. And some woman put, "Oh my God, yes, yes, yes." And I was just like, "Oh my God, that looks like a vomit fountain to me," and that's because I'm from New York and we don't really have that up here, so it's different. But yeah, that's important. Very good. I didn't think of that, Ellis. Good. But we have about 4 minutes left. So if you guys have anything that you want to do a giveaway, or if you have something you want to ask your readers, the readers to, or the authors to, follow you or give out your information if they have any questions, I'm going to go around. We'll start with Jenn, and you can all say what you want with that.
Just really quickly about the food thing, also the unexpectedness. So Ottawa has a huge Lebanese community, and there are shawarma places all over. It is like the thing in Ottawa, and it's so unexpected considering that the background of the city is English and French. So anyway, it's really interesting. That's a really good point, Ellis. For where people can find me, you can join my reader group on Facebook. It's Jenn Burke's Epic Adventurers. I'll put a link in the comments on the post in the group. I'll remember to do it. I didn't do that this morning for my other one, but I will remember to do it. And you can also find me on, pardon me, on Facebook, Jenn Burke Author. And on Twitter, I'm at JERALIBU, Jeralibu. So that's basically where I am, my tag everywhere. So.
There we go. Drinks become an important piece too. You know, we talk about our food, but our drinks come in. How you're going to get your Vernors and your Faygo in Michigan, and you may not find that anywhere else. Lord knows my husband now has some in the refrigerator here because we did find some in South Carolina and we're hoarding it.
I danced in the grocery store when I went to my neighborhood grocery store here. Don't understand stuff. This is Vernors is it, but Vernors was drinks. Mm-hmm.
So, you know, in addition to our food, we have to consider our drinks. And some of those things do come up unusually in certain areas. Like I said, not only was Amherst, Ohio known as this town for sandstone, but we became the potato capital of the world because we could consume the most potatoes at one time. So we had a dancing potato for our events. I'm not really sure who they paid to dress up as a potato and dance, but you know, the festivals, those little key things become so important, and food and drink are part of that. You can find me on melissakeir.com, and I'm on Facebook, and I will post links to that as well as my Facebook group.
Okay, Ellis?
Yeah, I am ellisleigh.com. Leigh is spelled Leigh. I will post in the RTC group for sure. I had some giveaways from a couple weeks ago when we did these. So I'll post in there with how to find me. I have a free book through my newsletter, so I'll post that link. Also, if you want to check out some fun, dirty, erotic romance based on a fictional town very much like Mackinac Island in Michigan. My London Hale pen name starts Monday. We're going to be on the Read Me Romance podcast. So Brighton and I wrote a book called Forbidden Protector, and that's going to be on Read Me Romance podcast. That's for free. So you can just listen to it. First half of the book will be Monday. Second half is on Friday. So that's out there as well. But ellisleigh.com, and I'm around.
You can reach me, Marianne, Morea.com, or you can follow me on Facebook as, you know, it's just Marianne Morea, author. And you can follow me on BookBub, or I don't really do Twitter, so don't even bother. So I can tell you that much. Don't even bother. I don't tweet. So that's not a good thing, because we all share readers, because people don't just read one thing. They don't just read one author. So share the love. Anyway, thank you all, Jenn, Melissa, Ellis. Thank you. Thank you, everybody who showed up. Thank you, Jessica, for helping us in our tech area. Have a great rest of your weekend, everybody. Ciao, ciao.